So I'm quickly going to do a video on how you can quickly graph these two functions, f of x equals sine of x and g of x equals cos of x. Knowing how to graph these two functions without a calculator is extremely important in mathematics because they're a base function, and we're going to be applying lots of transformations later on to these two functions. Now, to begin, let's start off by drawing out two rough sketches of a graph, okay? And we gotta understand these two things, these two functions have two similarities, okay? They both have a maximum of +1 and a minimum of -1, okay? And remember, these two functions both relate to our unit circle. So I'm not going to write out the entire unit circle. I actually don't care about lots of these points. I'm just trying to get a rough sketch of these two sine and cos functions. Okay, what I care about are my quadrantal angles. Okay, so I care about at 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi, because that's going to give me one full rotation, which is going to allow me to essentially just copy and paste what I've done because it's a repeating function. Okay, now furthermore, I'm going to care about my x and y coordinates of these. Okay, because remember, my x and y coordinates on my unit circle are directly related to my cos ratio of the angle and my sine ratio of whatever angle we're talking about. Recognize that x on our function graphs here is the angle at what we're talking about. Okay, so to begin off, the first things I'm going to note is my x coordinates, which are my angles. Okay, so let's make this side sine, so f of x equals sine x, and this side let's make it cos x. Okay, now again, I'm just going to do one repetition, so I'm going to try and make these equal length apart. So I start at 0, and then my next angle will be pi over 2, then pi, then 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. And it's going to be the same thing for cos. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. So now I already have my quadrantal angles represented on my x-axis. Okay. Now, these are quite easy to remember for what your coordinate values are, right? Here we have an x value of 1 because it's the unit circle, then 0. Our x value here will be 0 and 1 as y, and then our x value at pi is -1. Our y value is 0, and then at 3 pi over 2, we have an x value of 0 and a y value of -1. So let's first focus on sine, okay? So when the angle is 0, right, that's what we're talking about there. When our angle is 0, so right here, our y value, which is sine angle, is 0. So we actually start off at 0, 0. And this is an easy starting point to remember. Okay, so we have a starting point on our sine graph at 0 and 0. It's at the origin. Then pi over 2, let's look at what's happening at pi over 2. Well, at pi over 2, sine is 1. So now we're at our maximum. So this is at pi over 2 and 1. Now what's going on when we're at pi? Well, we're at pi, our y value, which again is sine, is at 0. So now this is another 0 value. 3 pi over 2, our sine value is at -1. So now we're at our minimum. And now we've done a full rotation because we're all the way back at 2 pi. Remember, at 2 pi, our y value, which is our sine ratio, is 0. So right here. And now we can try and connect these points as best as we can. And we already have the first repetition of our sine graph. Now let's go over here and look at cos. Okay, I'm going to maybe do this in let's do it in green. Okay, so we're going to look at g of x and no g of x. Okay, so when we're at 0, when our angle's at 0 on our unit circle, okay, x, which is related to cos, is 1. So our beginning point, our starting point, is at 0 and 1. Okay, there's our starting point. Now let's go on to pi over 2. So that's our next quadrantal angle. At pi over 2, x is 0. So when we are at pi over 2, y value is going to be 0 on our g of x graph. Okay, because remember, if we plug in cos at pi over 2 here, we are going to get a resulting 0. So this is our y on our graph. This is our x. Okay, that's what a bit of the confusing part here is when you're trying to do this in our unit circle. But you just got to remember our y here, our y-axis here, is plotting cos at x. Okay, it's plotting g of x. Now, where are we at when we're at pi? So at pi, our x value is -1. So now we are at -1. At 3 pi over 2, oh, I plotted that in the wrong spot. At pi, we're at -1. At 3 pi over 2, our x-coordinate's at 0. So now we are at another root. And then at 2 pi, we have made a full rotation, and our x-coordinate is +1. I'm just going to quickly move this up a little bit, and we can plot our +1 happily. So now we can roughly combine these points. Okay, and now we have our first cycle. Okay, so we have our period here. And if you wanted to keep graphing this, I guess I can move this over a little bit. If you wanted to keep on graphing this, you would just continue the repetition. So let's maybe show a continued cos graph here. So cos of x, okay, so g of x. We've already shown how to graph the first few points here. So we got 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, and then you would just keep going around and around, right? So if we draw it out, we have 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, and then this guy here, well, that's going to be pi over 2 plus 2 pi, right? Because we're going to do a full rotation around. So that will be pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2. So I'm just getting the same denominators here. That's going to give me 5 pi over 2. So our next, this all the way around, is 5 pi over 2. So recognize I'm just showing you this because we could keep going on here. So let's roughly go and start graphing our points. So -1 up. So we know how to get there, and then our next step would be 5 pi over 2. We don't have to find this necessarily because we just now go down and make that connection, right? And then our next point, well, this would have to be 3 pi. Okay, so if we were to plot 3 pi here, well, we would come down and 3 pi would be down here. And then we would just keep repeating the cycle. So you can see our period, our cycle, we're essentially just copy and pasting and making sure we have the proper x coordinates, which is our angles on our unit circle. So I hope that was helpful. Biggest thing is knowing how to get this and this fairly easily, okay?